After religion, if you think about it, what is the other human activity which is universal, seems to have been there right from the beginning of society, and is imbued and endowed with lots of ritual? They point to the sky, they eat chicken before their games, and they'll pay $3 million for a home run ball. Now, what could be stranger than that? I'm Prof Hood. I'm from the University of Bristol in England, and I'm a developmental psychologist. One of the reasons I went to university was actually to look into the phenomenon of the paranormal. I remember Uri Geller bending spoons, and this completely blew me away in many ways. And so I wanted to find out what this was, the mind and consciousness. And I bought into this whole story about the supernatural. My interest in the supernatural waned when I discovered there was no real reliable evidence for it. And I kind of gave up that pursuit of that interest and just got into studying the emerging mind. And so I did that for about 20 years. And more recently, I kind of went back to my first interest, my first passion, which was the supernatural, because I recognized that human adults have all sorts of quirks of thinking. This was part of my research into the mind. And I started to realize that so-called supernatural beliefs could actually have an origin in children, as opposed to the common assumption is that we believe what we're told by society. So I kind of got interested in this idea of looking or tracing or trying to find the evidence that these beliefs come from within the child. And I think I've done so to a certain extent. If you look at the way that children reason about the world, they come up with all sorts of explanations to make sense of it. And very often those explanations are perfectly accurate. But other times they come up with all weird, bizarre notions and ideas about things, which if they were really true, would be supernatural. So for example, children think that vision works by something leaving the eyes, a little bit like Superman. Okay? And if you ask them to draw vision, they have these little arrows coming out of the eyes. Now, in fact, vision doesn't work that way at all. Vision works by information coming into the eyes. But if you think about this idea that somehow seeing is a process of, imposing yourself on the world or looking out towards the world, then that explains why 9 out of 10 adults think they can tell when they're being watched from behind. This is such a common assumption that people don't even recognize that, in fact, that would be supernatural if it were really true. So something which is just a misconception about how vision works could be seen to be the basis of what is a very common supernatural belief. The other one I should mention is the idea of the mind being separate to the body. Technically, we call this mind-body dualism. And this is something that most people assume without ever questioning it. They assume the mind is somehow independently of the body because we experience that every day. We have a thought about having a cup of coffee and then we move our hand to pick it up. And we never really question that idea that somehow the mind can control the physical system. So mind-body dualism is a fascinating area, both in science but also in philosophy. And this assumption that the mind is separate to the body is something that children at 4 or 5 years of age will spontaneously think about. But if you then make that assumption, then that means the mind isn't constrained by the same laws that constrain the physical body, which then allows for the possibility of an afterlife, the mind somehow existing once the body is gone. So you can see very easily how that kind of notion could underpin notions of the afterlife, ghosts, spirits, and so forth. And that's what I think culture is building upon. I don't think we're indoctrinating children with the idea of ghosts. I think that's just a natural way of thinking about the living body.